Today we're going to be dissecting and analyzing Genesis 10, the Table of Nations. We just did a video detailing the story of Nimrod, even identifying who he is. And earlier we did one of what happened to Noah and his son Ham. Those are going to be helpful to watch before this. They're longer videos, but there are important points in there that correspond to Genesis 10. You see, the end of Genesis 9, in addition to Genesis 10 and 11, all happen in the same time frame. And we're going to be showing that here. We're going to take this chapter apart and try to see everything we can possibly see from a few different angles. We'll use new and exciting tools like looking at the Hebrew text, laying out the biblical timeline, analyzing lifespans, and connecting all the parallels. Then add that with the things we learned from the other videos about Ham and Nimrod, and by the end of this video, once it all gets connected together, it will give you a deeper understanding of what happened at the Tower of Babel. I don't think you're going to see another approach like this.
Before we get into Genesis 10, we're going to set it up briefly. This is after the great flood of Noah, where only 8 people on earth were saved, and from there the whole earth was repopulated. Noah and his family are the only ones to survive the flood. There was Noah, his wife, they had 3 sons, and all the sons had wives, and that made 8 people total. Genesis 10 lists all the descendants of Noah's sons that repopulated the earth. It's informally known as the Table of Nations because it lists the first nations that came off the ark to repopulate the world. Traditionally, in Jewish culture, there are 70 nations, and we're going to confirm that interpretation here, even though there's more than 70 names listed. Now, if you haven't seen our video on Nimrod and the Tower of Babel, or at least know about the Tower of Babel, you're going to be at a disadvantage because knowledge of the Tower of Babel in chapter 11 is very important to break down Genesis 10. God scattering the people after the Tower of Babel is a marking point throughout this chapter. The tower started with the whole earth having one language living near each other in Shinar. And by the end of the tower story, God had scattered the people into different lands with different languages. Now, as we look back at the Table of Nations in Genesis 10, we know Noah came off the ark with his 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And at the end of each of the sons' descendants in the Table of Nations, the verses say this. Japheth. From these the coastland peoples of the Gentiles were separated into their lands, everyone according to his language, according to their families, into their nations. These were the sons of Ham, according to their families, according to their languages, in their lands and in their nations. These were the sons of Shem, according to their families, according to their language, in their lands, according to their nations. The descendants of Noah were separated to the different nations, according to each other's languages. That tells you right there that that is because God scattered the people with different languages from the Tower of Babel story. Now, if we take off all the highlights, we can see in the beginning that Noah's sons came off the ark after the flood, had a common language, and somewhere along the line to the end in verse 32, the people were separated by God. But where is that point of separation? You're going to see there's lots of indications from the Tower of Babel dispersion noted within the Table of Nations in Genesis 10. Now, most people mark the time of the Tower of Babel dispersion here in chapter 10 within the list of Shem's descendants. To Eber were born 2 sons. The name of one was Peleg, for in his days the earth was divided. I agree with this take. During the days of Peleg, the earth was divided. That is when God stopped the people from building the Tower of Babel, confused their languages, and separated the people to the 70 nations. But this isn't the only indication that the dispersion of Babel is marked in the Table of Nations. In fact, there's lots more. First, we're going to start to analyze the descendants of Japheth. The sons of Japheth were Gomer, Magog, Madai, Javan, Tubal, Meshesh, and Tiras. The sons of Gomer were Ashkenaz, Riphath, and Togarmah. And the sons of Javan were Elisha, Tarshish, Kittim, and Dodamine. From these the coastland peoples of the Gentiles were separated into their lands, everyone according to his language, according to their families, into their nations. That is 15 people, including Japheth. But if you look at it in Hebrew, you'll see something important. Nearly all of the names are just names, except when you look at the sons of Javan. Let's clear everything else out so we can look at verse 4. If you look at the basic sentence structure of this verse, at the beginning of the names Tarshish and Dodamim, you see there's a Vav. There is no Vav in front of Elisha and Kittim. This Vav is a prefix which means and. If this was a list of 4 straight names, then Kittim should have a Vav also, but it doesn't. So this sentence basically reads, the sons of Javan, Elisha and Tarshish, comma, Kittim and Dodamine. The absence of a Vav in the Kittim puts a break between the 2 sets of names. But that's not all. Another reason the Katim and Dodamine stand out is that they both have the same suffix ending, hirik, yod, and mem. That suffix indicates a plural number. The fact they are spoken of as plural people that inherit a nation means this came after the dispersion of people at Babel. Let's bring this back into the English translation. This also reveals that it's no coincidence that the Katim and Dodamine were listed last. The other 13 names listed were in Babel, during the time of the Tower of Babel, so they are just regular names, while the Katim and Dodamine are plural, indicating they came after Babel. These two peoples are an indication of the dispersion of Babel in this table of nations, and that is why they are separated and listed as plural peoples. So let's see if we can see more indications of the Tower of Babel dispersion in Ham's descendants. First, the sons of Ham were Cush, Mizraim, Put, and Canaan. The name that stands out here is Mizraim. We'll get to him in a minute when his descendants are listed. But now we get to the next list. And the sons of Cush were Seba, Havilah, Shabta, Rama, and Sebdeka. Nothing unusual about these names. Then the next ones. And the sons of Rama were Sheba and Dedan. Again, just regular names, nothing to indicate any plural names. Now to Nimrod. Cush begot Nimrod. Now we just did an extensive video analyzing the Hebrew text to identify Nimrod. You'll have to watch it to find out how he broke down the Hebrew to prove his identity. Without going into detail, Nimrod is not actually a person, but a rebellion against God. This verse should actually be properly translated as Cush brought forth rebellion, as in Cush was the leader behind the Tower of Babel. And in the Nimrod video, it detailed another indication of the timing of Babel's dispersion. Let's highlight and read about the kingdom of Nimrod in the original Hebrew. We read from right to left. And the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, and Erech, and Akkad, and Calneh, in the land of Shinar. From that land he went to Assyria, and built Nineveh, and Reboth Ir, and Calah, and Rezin, between Nineveh and Calah, that is the great city. Now, if Nimrod's story is the Tower of Babel story, which most people agree on, then ask yourself, why would Nimrod start his kingdom in Babel and from there move on to Assyria and build 4 more cities? That doesn't make any sense, knowing that the people of Babel knew they were disobeying God by centralizing in one location. This is a conflict with the context of the Tower of Babel story. Why would Nimrod move into new areas? You see, Hebrew is a nimble language, and words can mean different things based on the context. And you can see the sentence structures are not anything like English. But we need to focus on just one word here. Zoom in on it. This is the word for Assyria, Ashur. Now that word looks very familiar. Let's zoom back out with verse 11 at the top, and now let's take a peek at Shem's sons in verse 10:22. From right to left, the sons of Shem, Elam and Asher and Arphaxad and Lud and Aram. Look at that! One of Shem's sons was named Asher. Let's clear everything else out and put the name of Asher in verse 22 next to what the translations use as Assyria in verse 11. They are nearly identical. In fact, that first letter to the name Asher in verse 22 is a Vav. And when Vav is used at the front of a word, it becomes a prefix, which means and. So that is why this translation in verse 22 reads, and Asher. So if we take away the prefix Vav, then we see the rest of the letters match each other. And the name Asher is spelled exactly the same way as the translated name of the country Assyria. Now we know that in the Bible, the lands were open for people to settle, and most lands were named after the people who settled them, or their family members. Canaan was called that because there was a Canaan. Israel was named that after the patriarch Israel. And in fact, the names themselves became the actual lands that people referred to. So the name of Shem's son Asher actually becomes the word for Assyria. So that means that Asher was the person who had to settle Assyria, not Nimrod. But what about that translation? Let's go back to the original Hebrew in Genesis 10:11. And since Hebrew is a nimble language where words can mean different things based on the context, what if most of the translations of the Bible got it wrong, and that this word in verse 11 was referring to the man Asher and not the country Assyria? Then let's put that into the verse. Now we'll add in a typical English translation. Change the word for Assyria to Asher there. Now we'll focus on the word before it, Yatsa. That is a verb that can also mean go out or went forth. So we'll change it to he went forth. Now the translators thought that the word Asher meant Assyria, so they added the male pronoun he to Yatsa. But there's not actually a male pronoun here. So we'll drop it in this translation. Now remember I told you the sentence structure of Hebrew is not like English. Usually you have to move the nouns in front of the verbs. So this verse should actually be better read as, from that land Asher went forth and built Nineveh. You see, this makes way more sense. Asher would be the founder and settler of his own country. That is why the country would be named after him. And Nimrod's story is about consolidating power in one location, in Babel. So Nimrod did begin his kingdom and build Babel, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar, as verse 10 indicates, but then Asher would have went from there and built Nineveh, Rehoboth, Ir, Kala, and Rezin in verses 11 and 12. You have to understand the context of the Tower of Babel to understand one of the most common mistranslations in the Bible. Nimrod didn't go on to Assyria. Nimrod is actually Cush. And Cush left Babel and founded Ethiopia with the rest of Ham's family in Africa. So we can pinpoint the dispersal of Babel right here between verses 10 and 11. Cush is Nimrod. His kingdom was Babel. God broke up the building of the city. Then Asher left and built up the cities of Assyria with the rest of Shem's family who remained living in the area of Mesopotamia. But why would it be written in this way? Why would Asher's story be written right after the story of Nimrod? Now we have to incorporate our video about Noah and his son Ham. We talked about in that video how Ham raped Noah's wife, his own mother, that produced a child Canaan. Now if that is true, then Canaan would be Noah's son through his wife. This is confirmed through Genesis 9:24 through 29, when Noah gave an end-of-life blessing to his sons, which included Shem, Japheth, and Canaan. So Noah thought of Canaan as his son, although he was a product of the heinous rape of his wife by his son Ham. I know this sounds gross, but this is why Noah cursed Canaan. In the video about Noah and Ham, we also showed that Ham wasn't mentioned here, because he was disowned by the family at this point. But if we know that Noah had 4 sons, not just 3, then we can analyze the Table of Nations and see that there are 4 family lines that are described as settling land: Japheth, Nimrod, who is Cush, Canaan, and Shem. Japheth and Shem make sense as they are sons of Noah. Canaan makes sense if he was the son of Noah from his wife, even through rape. And since Nimrod is not a person but actually Cush, and since Ham was disowned by the family because of the rape, then his land rights would be inherited by his firstborn Cush. That is why there are 4 descendant lines described as settling land here in the Table of Nations. And that is why Asher's story would be told structurally within the story of Cush. Asher is a descendant of Shem and would stay near his relatives in Mesopotamia. But the structure of the Table of Nations had to only have the 4 sons of Noah settling land. And that is why Asher's story would be told here. And like I said, it was another indication of the dispersal of Babel in Genesis 10. Now we can go on to the next person in the Table of Nations. And that is Ham's son Mizraim. We'll enlarge it here. That first letter Vav with a dot in it is called the vowel Shurek. This letter at the beginning of his name is a prefix meaning and. But if you look at the ending, this name is in a different form, not like the other plural form. You have a yod, hirik, and then a mem. The hirik, the small dot, comes between the yod and the mem. That suffix ending is called a dual form. It specifically means two. Now, most people take this to mean that when Egypt was founded, there were 2 Egypts, upper and lower. That sounds like a fair interpretation to me, but the name Mizraim is in dual form. And now let's go to his descendants. And Mizraim begat Ludim, Anamim, Lehabim, Naphtuhim, Pathrusim, Casluhim. From them came the Philistines, the Kephtorites. Now we'll drop out all the words except for the names. Now I'll stack the names in 2 rows so you can see the endings. On every single one of those names is a hirik, yod, and then a mem. On these, the hirik comes before the yod and the mem. Again, this is a plural suffix. And don't worry about the English translations of the last 2, the Philistines and the Kephtorites, because in Hebrew they are pronounced Pelishtim, Kephtorim. So all the descendants of Mizraim are in plural form, Hirik, Yod, and then Mem. So if Mizraim is in dual form to denote Upper and Lower Egypt, and the country Egypt was settled after the Tower of Babel, and all his descendants are in plural form, then we're on solid ground that Mizraim and his descendants were also born after Babel. This is another indication of peoples coming after God scattered the people, and another marking of the dispersion of Babel in the Table of Nations. Now, the next person listed in the Table of Nations is Canaan. We just talked about the video about Noah and his son Ham, that Canaan was the product of a heinous rape by Ham of Noah's wife, his own mother. I know it sounds gross, but it's detailed in that video.
We'll get more into the timing of all this at the end of this video, but if the timing of Noah's blessing of his sons coincided with the Tower of Babel, then we can see that marked in the story of Canaan. Let's look at the descendants of Canaan in Hebrew.
And Canaan begot Sidon, his firstborn, and Heth. Now we're going to pause here because these are normal names. Although in Hebrew, the names Sidon and Heth come from root words. Sidon from Sud, meaning hunting, and Heth from hot, meaning terror. And once you watch the video about Nimrod, you'll see why those names bring a much deeper meaning to what was happening at the Tower of Babel. Because Nimrod, who was Cush, was a mighty hunter. And the people of God were being forced and terrorized to worship other gods. And once we confirm that the blessing of Noah, which included the cursing of Canaan, happened at the same time frame as the Tower of Babel, then you'll see how these two sons of Canaan connect to the story of Cush Nimrod. But we're going to go back and continue with the rest of the sons of Canaan. The Jebusite, the Amorite, the Girgashite, the Hivite, the Archite, the Sinite, the Arvadite, the Zemarite, the Hamathite. Now we'll take the last 9 names, separate them, and put them in order because they share the same form. You'll notice they all begin with the he and the vowel padak or comments, which is a prefix which means the. But then look at the common ending to all of those names. You have a hirik yod at the end of all the names. There is no mem this time. This suffix to a word means possession and belonging to. So that is why these names are translated the way they are to the Jebusite, the Amorite, and so forth. That means these names become a people that belong to the subject of the sentence, which is Canaan at the beginning. It's a different way of indicating the plural of people that came from Canaan. So the last 9 names, beginning with the Jebusites, were people that all belong and came from the person Canaan. So again, we're on solid ground to say that this means, because of the possessive suffix and the he prefix, that all these last 9 peoples in the list of the Canaanites happened after the dispersion of Babel by God, which is confirmed by the last part of the sentence, V'achar napasu mishpahot hakanaani. That word viahar can also mean afterward, or more literally, the hind part. And napasu means dispersed or scattered in pieces. So now we read in literal English, after the hind part, the families were dispersed of the Canaanites. So this confirms these last 9 names are another marking they came after the dispersal of Babel. So now we can get to the last section and the favored son of Noah, Shem. Let's talk about that first sentence. And children were born also to Shem, the father of all the children of Eber, the brother of Japheth the elder. This kind of singles out one name in his descendants, and that name is Eber. Now, most people say that this is how the name Hebrew came from, Eber to Hebrews. That sounds accurate to me, but does it signify something larger? If you watch my video on Nimrod, you'll know that the people were in open rebellion against God by replacing him by worshiping other celestial gods. This verse in Joshua reveals what happened at Babel. Their ancestors, including Terah, the father of Abraham, lived beyond the Euphrates River and worshipped other gods. This is talking about what happened at the Tower of Babel. So if we go back to the other slide, this becomes deeply significant that Eber is singled out here, and that Shem is described as the father of the children of Eber. Remember, Eber became the name for the Hebrew people, the name of God's chosen people. I said at the beginning that Genesis 9, 10, and 11 are interconnected and happened at the same time frame. I will prove that when we get to the timeline. Let's bring in Genesis 9 and Noah's prayers to his sons. He clearly states that Yahweh is the God of Shem, something he doesn't say for his other sons, which leads to the conclusion that the families of Japheth, Canaan, and Ham, who is not mentioned here, had abandoned following Yahweh. And if we show Shem's descendants here on the right, we can highlight in blue the followers of Yahweh we know about, Shem and Eber. Then place the verse from Joshua here at the bottom, where he talks about the ancestors that lived beyond the Euphrates River and worshipped other gods. This is talking about what happened at the Tower of Babel in Genesis 11, and it singles out one name in particular, Terah, the father of Abraham, is also worshiping other gods. So we can highlight his name in yellow to show that he abandoned Yahweh and worshipped other gods. So not only the families of Japheth, Canaan, and Ham, but somewhere between Eber and Terah, the chosen descendant line of Shem had abandoned Yahweh too. Now we go back to the rest of the descendants in Shem's line. The names are straightforward. The sons of Shem were Elam, Asher, Arphaxad, Lud, and Aram. The sons of Aram were Uz, Hul, Gether, and Mash. Arphaxad begat Salah, and Salah begat Eber. To Eber were born 2 sons. The name of one was Peleg, for in his days the earth was divided, and his brother's name was Joktan. Joktan begat Almodad, Sheleph, Hazarmaveth, Jerah, Hadaram, Uzal, Dekla, Obal, Abemiel, Sheba, Ophir, Havilah, and Jobab. All these were the sons of Joktan. There aren't any plural names, nor dual suffixes. We cannot denote any prefixes either. So looking at the names and the descendants of Shem leads us to conclude that all these descendants were present during the Tower of Babel story. All 27 names. And then they were dispersed to their lands after God had scattered them. And if you look at the table of nations and total the descendants of Noah's sons, the regular names from Japheth are 13 names. The descendants of Ham have 14 regular names. We're going to talk about that asterisk in a minute. And then the descendants of Shem have 27 regular names. We can say confidently that these people were present during the Tower of Babel. Then you can also total up the plural names from the table of nations, 2 from Japheth's family, 18 from Ham's family, none from Shem's, for a total of 20, and surmise that these 20 peoples came after the dispersion of Babel by God. Now, that number of people at Babel does not mean there aren't more people than that. We know women were not counted for one. And indeed, we can confirm through other sections of the Bible, these people were alive during the Tower of Babel, yet not named in the Table of Nations. Noah, Reu, Serug, Nahor the first, Terah, Haran, Nahor the second, Abraham, Sarah, Milcah, Iscah, and Lot. There were probably lots more people alive during the Tower of Babel that just weren't listed in the Table of Nations. But I'm on solid ground that those 20 plural names were not there during the building of the tower, because the people were one in Babel, and there weren't different sets of peoples until after the dispersion of Babel. Now we have to break down the number of people. Jewish tradition has the number of nations that started after Babel at 70, even though you'll see there are more than 70 names listed. Let's count it together. First, we start with Japheth's descendants. Let's start with Japheth himself. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. We don't have to count Gomer here since he's already counted in verse 2. We start the count again with Ashkenaz. 9, 10, 11. Again, Javan is already counted. And start again with Elisha. 12, 13, 14, and 15. So we have 15 total nations from Japheth. We're going to put this total on a separate slide. Now let's count Ham's descendants, starting with Ham. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We don't have to count Cush. He was already counted in verse 6. Start again with Seba. 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Again, Rama already counted. 11, 12. Then count Nimrod, 13. Then go down to Mizraim in verse 13. But since he was already counted in verse 6, we start again with the Ludim. 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21. Again, skip over Canaan. He was also counted in verse 6, and start with Sidon. 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, 31, and 32. So we add 32 total names from Ham into our totals. Now we go to Shem's descendants. Again, we start with Shem. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Aram was already counted, and restart with Uz. 7, 8, 9, 10. Arphaxad was already counted in verse 22, and start with Salah, 11, then Eber, 12, skip to Peleg, 13, Joktan, 14, and restart with Almodad. 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, and 27. So we go to our list and add 27 names from Shem. So if we total up the names between the three sons, we come up with 74 total names. Okay, so here's the problem. Jewish tradition has the number of nations at 70. So why would there be 74 names listed in the table of nations? So here's where we bring in our video about Nimrod. We'll add in verse 8. And Cush begot Nimrod. Now, without getting into the Hebrew and how it was translated wrong, we'll add in the correct translation. And Cush brought forth rebellion. That means Nimrod wasn't a person, but the rebellion against God. So when we counted Nimrod as a descendant, he should not have been counted. And that's the reason for the asterisk. So we need to subtract Nimrod from the list. And now we're at 73 total names. We'll drop the thumbnail of Nimrod's video so we can add in a key verse to understand the table. These were the families of the sons of Noah, according to their generations, in their nations, and from these the nations were divided on the earth after the flood. The families of the sons of Noah. This means the sons of Noah are not supposed to be counted in the table of nations. So if we minus the three sons of Noah, we come up with the 70 nations, which matches Jewish tradition and connects the numbers. So that is how the 74 names listed in the table of nations should be counted as the 70 original nations after the flood.
Now we can talk about something exciting, analyzing the timeline of the tower to try and pinpoint when this happened. The Bible's really helpful for generally keeping track of when the events occurred. From the genealogies listed in Genesis 5 and 11, we can see when the descendants were born and died all the way from creation to beyond the flood, and to the time of the Tower of Babel.
So we start by numbering creation year 1 when Adam was made, and then take the years when the descendants of Adam were born, listed in the genealogy in Genesis 5. We don't come to the first death until Adam dies in year 930. I ran out of room, so I left out Enoch being taken by God in 987. Then Seth dies in 1042. And we come to Noah being born in the year 1056. Let's slide this over so we can show more dates until the Great Flood. We get a few more deaths, then we come to the birth of Noah's sons, Ham, Japheth, and Shem. The video I did about Noah and his son Ham talked about the birth order of Noah's sons, and how it had to be in the order of Ham, Japheth, and then Shem. We won't dwell on that here since we're getting to the flood. But then Noah's father Lamech died in 1651, and then the great flood of Noah happened in 1656. Although not mentioned here, Methuselah also died in 1656, the same year as the great flood, probably by the flood. Again, these aren't BC dates, but years from creation. Then we'll slide this over again, and now take the info from the genealogy in Genesis 11. This is the important descendant line from Shem, the last son to stay true and follow Yahweh. We get to the birth of Abram here. This is Abraham before his name change, then come to a couple deaths, Peleg and Nahor the first. Then we finish this section off by showing Noah's death in 2006, that is years after creation. Now if you look at the totality of this slide, from the time of the Great Flood until the death of Peleg and Nahor, there were no deaths in this descendant line. We'll get into this more later when we reveal something deeper. But no one dying until Peleg and Nahor is significant. But for now, since Peleg's lifetime was a key marker we talked about earlier, let's drop out everything else so we can highlight his lifespan more clearly. Again, we'll show the verse from 1025 in the Table of Nations. To Eber were born 2 sons. The name of one was Peleg, for in his days the earth was divided. Now most Christian scholars, at least the ones that believe in the truth of the Bible, have concluded that this means that during the lifetime of Peleg, that Babel was dispersed by God, and the people were separated into their own nations. I agree with this interpretation. Sometime between the year 1757 and the 239 years that Peleg lived until 1996, God dispersed and separated the people into the 70 original nations. That's a pretty solid span of time when the dispersion of Babel occurred. But is there any way to narrow the date of the dispersion closer? Yep, there sure is. Let's wipe this clean. We know from the first genealogy and the story of Noah that he was born in the year 1056. He lived 950 years and died in the year 2006. Nowhere in Noah's story does it talk about the Tower of Babel. But if we show the lifetime of Peleg here, and then lay a shaded area to show his lifetime, because this area shows the parameters of time when Babel was dispersed and the people separated into their nations. So if we show the lifetime of Noah with these arrows, we can plainly see he was alive when the people were separated by God. And since all the earth was one during the construction of the Tower of Babel, that means no one lived outside the kingdom of Babel. And if Noah was alive during the tower, therefore Noah was there in Babel during the Tower of Babel, the open rebellion against God. You've probably never heard that before, but we do know something else significantly happened to Noah from the video about his evil son. Ham raped Noah's wife, his own mother. I'm not going to go over it again. You'll have to watch the video to see proof in the connections. But in the video, and I've said it earlier here, that Noah gave an end-of-life blessing to his sons, Canaan, Shem, and Japheth. Again, you'll have to watch the video to see that Canaan was Noah's son through his wife. But take note here that Ham was not included in this blessing and curse because the family had already disowned him due to the rape. Then we have to take the knowledge in our video about identifying Nimrod. It's a longer video, but basically Nimrod is Cush, the son of Ham, and Cush was the leader behind the Tower of Babel. So if Ham raped Noah's wife, and his son Cush was the leader of Babel, the open rebellion against God, then those two evil events seem to be connected as they are father and son. And if Noah's blessing and curse was an end-of-life blessing, then by definition, it was towards the end of Noah's life. Let's go back to the timeline zoomed in on the last 30 years of Peleg's life. Remember, most scholars agree that his lifetime was when Babel was dispersed and the people separated into nations. If we add in the date of Noah's death at 2006, then we can also deduce when Noah's end-of-life blessing happened. These end-of-life blessings usually occurred 10 to 20 years before someone died, so we can place that span here on the timeline. So Noah's end-of-life blessing probably occurred between the years 1986 and 1996 in years after creation. Look at where that span of time ends, the same year that Peleg died. Do you think that's a coincidence? I don't. We'll analyze this more when we investigate the lifespans of people next. But with Noah's end-of-life blessing occurring during the lifetime of Peleg, and Peleg's lifetime is believed to be when the earth was divided by God, then we can deduce that the tower was stopped and Babel dispersed during the same span of time as Noah's blessing. I don't think I'm going too far out on a limb here. Let's take what we know so far from here with our previous videos. Ham raped Noah's wife, his own mother. That rape produced a child named Canaan. We know when we analyzed the children of Canaan, only his first two children were regular names, and the rest were in plural, which meant that the last 9 descendants came after the dispersal of Babel. But if the first two were in Babel before the dispersal, then Canaan must have been old enough to have children while in Babel. Then we take clues from the root words of their names, Sidon from hunting and Heth from terror. Those names give us meaning to what was happening in Babel as we connect information from our video about Nimrod. From that video, I think it's conclusively proven from the original Hebrew text that Cush is Nimrod. The text also said that he was a mighty hunter, which connects the name of Canaan's firstborn Sidon. Add in that Cush was the leader behind the tower and kingdom of Babel, and we take the knowledge from every source, both secular and religious, that Babylon was the originator of astrology, and astrology, the worship of stars, then we know something big was going on here. Then lastly, in the video about Nimrod, we showed how the translation of Genesis 10:9 had been wrong, and we properly retranslated it to be, like the rebellion, the mighty hunt before the face of the Lord, which sounds a lot more sinister, like people were being rounded up and hunted before God, which connects both the sons of Canaan, whose names mean hunting and terror. And we've shown that these two sons of Canaan were in Babel. So as we think of Noah's end-of-life blessing, we've shown that Noah had to have been in Babel. And in his blessing, Noah cursed Canaan to be a servant of his brethren. We can take from that, since Canaan's sons were named after what Cush was doing, that Canaan was involved with the Tower of Babel as a servant of Cush's brother, which adds another element as to why Noah would curse his grandson Canaan to be a servant of his brethren. And if you step back and see the rape of Noah's wife by her evil son Ham, then his two sons, Cush and Canaan, being behind the Tower of Babel, we know this open rebellion against God was by the whole family of Ham. And the worship of stars sounds like it might be by force, but we'll need to reinforce that in another way.
Which leads us to analyze the lifespans to offer more support to what happened at Babel. We get this information from the genealogies in Genesis 5 and 11. We can show the lifespans of each generation.
We start with Adam and move towards Noah. Adam lived 930 years. Seth lived 912 years. Enosh lived 905. Canaan 910. Mahalalel 890. Jared 962 years. Enoch only 365 years. Methuselah lived 969 years. Lamech 777 years. And we get Noah's age from chapter 9. He lived 950 years. I know that's quite a lifespan at first. Genetically, it would make sense as the human race would have been more pure at this time. But take special notice, not one of them lived to be 1,000 years, which is a key number. We'll talk about that some other time. Let's highlight the shortest one. Enoch only lived 365 years is because God took him. I believe that shortened lifetime is because he was threatened by the people of that time. Again, that will come in time. Then the next shortest age was Lamech, who lived 777 years. If you work it out yourself, you'll find that Lamech died 5 years before the Great Flood. So that seems more like an act of mercy by God, so he wouldn't die by the flood. But if you look at the rest of the ages, besides the two shortest ones for obvious reasons, generally the first 10 generations, including Noah, lived to be around or over 900 years old. Those ages become a sign of a horrible sin of the world. God was sorry that he made man at all, so he did something significant. And the Lord said, My spirit shall not strive with man forever, for he is indeed flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. God limited the lifespan of mankind to 120 years.
Now, when we look at the next genealogy in Genesis 11, you will see that people were living much beyond 120 years. Instead of making a hard stop at 120 years, God started to gradually limit the lifespan of humans. Now we'll look at the genealogy in Genesis 11 to see how the lifespans were decreasing gradually.
This genealogy is in a different format. We'll start at the top with Shem. The first verse is his age when he had his son Arphaxad at 100 years old. Then the next verse is how many years he lived after that, 500 years. So you have to do the math. 100 plus 500, and you get 600 total years that Shem lived. Then we come to the next name, Arphaxad, and see the same format. 35 years plus 403 years, and see that he lived 438 total years. We continue that for everyone. Salah, 30 plus 403, 433 total years. Eber, 34 plus 430 for 464 years of age. Then Peleg, 30 plus 209 for a total of 239. Reu, 32 plus 207 for 239. Serug, 30 plus 200 for 230. Then Nahor the first lived 29 years and had Terah, then lived 119 years afterwards for a total of 148 years. Lastly, we come to Terah. Verse 26 only mentions the age of when he had children, 70 years. But if you skip down to verse 32, you'll see that he lived 205 years of age when he died. So you can put that into the format above, 70 plus 135 for a total of 205 years. So if we highlight the lifespans of this genealogy, you can plainly see that the lifespans were decreasing. God was limiting the lifespan of mankind to 120, but he was doing it slowly in sets of generations. Now Shem, who lived 600 years at the top, was a son of Noah, and he was born before the flood. But everyone else from Arphaxad on down was born after the great flood. But I'm going to show you how to dig deeper that will lead us to something big. Now look at the first 3 generations after the flood. They all had similar lifespans. You have 438, 433, and 464, which are close to each other. You total the ages and divide by 3 to get to an average of 445 years in the first 3 generations after the flood. Then we put Shem's lifespan of 600 years at the top and figure out that the first 3 generations lived 74% of the lifespan of Shem. So that's a good barometer of how God was gradually decreasing the lifespans of mankind after the flood. Now let's look at the 3 generations after that. Again, all of these are similar in lifetimes. You have a lifetime of 239 years, another at 239, then the third at 230 years. We'll do the same math, total them, and see that the average in these 3 generations are 236 years. This time we'll put the lifetime of Eber here at the top, since he was the generation before these 3. And we can see that the second set of 3 generations lived about 50% of the total of the generation before them. That seems to be a faster decrease in lifespans between the 74% decrease in the first 3 generations. This acceleration to a 50% decrease might mean something, or at least requires more investigation. Now let's get rid of the box so we can focus on who this faster decrease started with. Oh, it's Peleg. That name popped up again. His lifespan was about 51% of his father's lifespan. This is the same person from earlier, where in his lifetime the earth was divided, which most people take that this is when Babel was dispersed. Peleg's lifespan accelerated the decrease in overall lifespans. This might mean something big if we can connect it to other things. But let's put a pin in this information and leave it aside for a moment. And since we don't have 3 more lifespans after this last set, let's look at the last 5 total. We can see they all appear to have similar lifespans, except for one. It kind of even stands out as I highlight it. That 148 years is another sharp decrease to a shorter lifetime. And you can tell it isn't even a decrease in lifespan. His son is the next generation afterward, and he lives 205 years or 57 years longer than his father. So let's keep the shorter life highlighted and find out who this person is. Nahor the First. Whoa, I think we've seen his name before. But before we get to that, let's highlight and emphasize that there are 2 lifespans that stand out in this list as showing a faster decrease in lifetime expectancy, and they are Peleg and Nahor the First. You would even be able to say they didn't live as long as they should have. Now remember the old slide I showed you of the biblical timeline from the Great Flood until the death of Noah? This also includes the lifetime of Peleg, which we know includes the Tower of Babel and its dispersal. We got this information from the genealogy in Genesis 11 and figured out the years from creation. But I did say earlier to pay attention that from 1656 and Noah's family coming off the ark until 1996, there were no deaths in this descendant line. This is due to this verse and a warning from God to Noah's family after they got off the ark. Surely for your lifeblood I will demand a reckoning. From the hand of every beast I will require it, and from the hand of man. From the hand of every man's brother I will require the life of man. Whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed, for in the image of God he made man. Before the flood, humans were murdering others, so God made it a law that if someone murders another, his own life would be in jeopardy. So when we go back to the timeline, this explains why no one was dying up until the year 1996. They were afraid of the consequence. Now we're going to zoom into the last 10 years of Peleg's life, up until the date of Noah's death to 2006. Remember, during the lifetime of Peleg was when Babel was dispersed and the people separated into nations. We've previously narrowed down the time range of the dispersal of Babel to the last years of Noah's life, to coincide with his end-of-life blessing, which probably occurred 10 to 20 years before his death, between the years 1986 to 1996. At that end-of-life blessing, Noah did curse Canaan to be a servant of his brethren. His children, Sidon and Heth, their names became words for what his brother Cush was doing, hunting and terrorizing, which led us to conclude that Canaan was involved as a servant of Cush. Thus the context as to why Noah would curse him, to be a servant of his brethren. Then Noah blessed the Lord, noted that Shem was the only son following Yahweh, and prayed Canaan would be a servant. And lastly, Noah prayed that Japheth would dwell in the tents of Shem. That is noteworthy because that means that Japheth was not following Yahweh at this point. Before we go on, if you want to see how Noah's prayer gets answered, then watch this video about the Apostle Paul. This video will show you how God is involved, and he does answer prayers. Now, syncing the Tower of Babel's dispersion to Noah's end-of-life blessing may seem circumstantial to you at this point, but we're going to add more layers to pinpoint this and prove something big was going on here. Now, remember from earlier, from the time of the Great Flood until Peleg's death, no one had died. And that's not all. According to Genesis 11, the whole earth were in the same location, Babel. Everyone lived in Babel, including Noah, Peleg, and Cush, the leader behind the Tower of Babel story. Now we're going to focus on Peleg. We just went through the lifespans and the genealogy after the flood and showed how Peleg's lifetime seemed to accelerate the decrease in lifespans towards God's mandate of limiting mankind to 120 years. Peleg lived 239 years. The 3 generations before him averaged 445 years, or 74% of Shem's lifetime. If Peleg were to live 74% of 445 years, he would have lived around 329 years. This is his life expectancy. So maybe there might be a reason why his life expectancy was cut short. Or maybe you think I haven't proven anything, that I'm trying to see something that might not be there. But now we're going to talk about the other lifespan that stood out in the genealogy after the flood, and that is Nahor the First, the grandfather of Abraham. He lived only 148 years. That lifetime also stood out as being cut short because his son Terah outlived him by 57 years. So clearly, there must be a reason why his lifetime was cut short. Okay, 2 people not living out their life expectancies. What does that have to do with anything? Until you see that Nahor the First also died in the year 1996, the same year as Peleg. Whoa, that circumstantial evidence is mounting up and pointing to something here, and it isn't good.
Now, if you've done this yourself, you might find Nahor's death might be off by a year. I've placed it here due to the fact that genetically, humans were more pure at this point. They weren't dying of heart attacks, cancer, or even car accidents. They were generally living out their lifespans, unless something bad happened to them. It doesn't make sense for Nahor to die prematurely after the dispersal. But it does make sense that he could have lived out most of his last year and get credit for that last year in Babel. This is just like Jesus not being dead in the cave for 3 full days. In the Bible, partial days get credit for the day itself. I'm 100% sure that Nahor died in the year 1996, in years after creation. And now there's one more death that we have to talk about that isn't listed in the genealogy.
And that person is Haran, the son of Terah. We get this information at the beginning of Abraham's story in Genesis 11. Now Terah lived 70 years and begot Abram, Nahor, and Haran. This is the genealogy of Terah. Terah begot Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Haran begot Lot. First off, this Abram is Abraham before his name change. Second, just because Terah's sons are listed in this order does not mean this is the order of their birth. Terah lived 70 years and finished having his 3 children. But one thing we can know is Haran is the brother of Abraham. The next thing we know about Haran comes from verse 29. The name of Nahor's wife, Milcah, the daughter of Haran. Haran was not only the father of Lot in verse 27 above, but also was old enough to have at least 4 children. And one of his daughters, Milcah, was old enough to marry his brother Nahor, which leads us to conclude pretty safely that Haran was older than Nahor II. And the last thing we know comes from verse 28. And Haran died before his father Terah in his native land, in Ur of the Chaldeans. In the Bible, the Chaldeans were considered Babylonians, and Ur was just south of Babel, close enough to be considered in the kingdom of Babel. So we can definitely say that Haran died in Babel before his father Terah. Before we get to the timeline, we need to go back to the genealogy in chapter 11 to note one thing. Look at Terah at the bottom. He was 70 years old when he had his 3 children. That does not mean he started having children at 70, but finished having them at 70. We really don't know when he started having his children. It could have been much earlier, before 70 years of age. Now, if we go to the top, Shem, the son of Noah, had his son at 100 years old. But there's a reason for that, as he was on the ark during the Great Flood. Not a great time to be having kids. But look at the 7 generations between Shem and Terah. And all of them had children when they were 29 through, at most, 35 years of age, right around 30. You can say that this was a cultural norm to be settled down and start having children by their early 30s. With that known, we go to the timeline, starting with the birth of Terah in 1878, and show the timeline until the death of Peleg in 1996. A reminder that nearly all biblical scholars that believe in the Bible think that Peleg's lifetime is the marking point for when Babel was dispersed and the people separated to the nations. On this channel, we think we can narrow down the dispersal of Babel to the last 10 years of Peleg's life, which coincides with Noah's end-of-life blessing, due to what he said there. But regardless, we can all agree that it was dispersed by the year 1996 and could not have happened later. We do know that Terah's son Haran was older than Nahor, since Nahor married his daughter, and probably was the firstborn son of Terah. And with the 7 generations before Terah having children at 29 through 35, then we can say with certainty that the earliest that Haran could have been born was 1907, or when Terah was 29 years old. And although highly unlikely, the latest Haran could have been born was when Terah was 7 years old, in the year 1948. But back to Peleg's death, marking the last endpoint when Babel was dispersed. And we know that Haran died before his father Terah in Babel. Then we can show the possible lifespans from the earliest date of his birth and the latest date of his possible birth. It is true that we don't know when Haran died, but we can say that the oldest he lived before his death was 89 years old. Or, if he was born around 1948, the youngest he possibly could have been before he died was 48 years old. His lifetime was anywhere between 48 to 89 years of age. And now we're going to tell you why this is important. First, we'll ghost everything back and leave the information about Haran. We know that Haran was the brother of Abraham. We go to Genesis 25 to find out a key detail about Abraham. This is the sum of Abraham's life, in which he lived 175 years. Abraham lived 175 years. That means his brother's Haran's life, at best, was only half of what his brother lived. This is not due to God limiting his lifespan. His life was cut short. And we know from the Bible that Haran died in Babel. Again, just like the other names, something else must be going on. We're going to go back to something from earlier in this video in order to reinforce and add to it. On the right here are Noah and the chosen descendant line of Shem, all the way to Terah's children, which includes Haran and Abraham. We have shown from Noah's end-of-life blessing that he blessed Yahweh, the God of Shem. He did not say that to his other sons, Canaan and Japheth. And we can say that Ham's family was evil and behind the Tower of Babel's open rebellion against God. So Shem, being the only son still following Yahweh, is very significant. We're going to highlight Shem in blue. We'll also add Noah in blue, since we can all agree that Noah was a righteous man and loyal to God. In Genesis 10, let's add the first verse speaking about the descendants of Shem. This second line highlighting Shem being the father of all the children of Eber becomes very important, because Eber not only becomes the language, but also became the name for God's loyal people, Eber to Hebrews. So let's highlight Eber here in blue as also staying loyal to Yahweh. We'll change this and bring back the verse in Joshua that talked about the Hebrew ancestors living beyond the Euphrates River and worshiping other gods. We know the only time that happened was in Babel, specifically talking about what happened at the Tower of Babel. Joshua called out Terah, the father of Abraham, as worshiping other gods. There were more, but we can only deal with facts. At least we can highlight Terah in yellow as abandoning Yahweh and worshiping other gods. Now let's take away the verses on the left to talk about what we just discovered. In the genealogy in Genesis 11, we know that Peleg lived 30 plus 209 for a total of 239 years. In researching the lifespans, we discovered that Peleg's lifetime was short of his life expectancy. If he followed the 3 previous generations and the rate of decrease, he should have lived around 329 years. That may seem thin to you, but let's go further with the next name, Nahor. He lived 29 plus 119 for a total of 148 years. We absolutely know his life was cut short, and this was not his life expectancy, since his son Terah outlived him by 57 years. So this death stands out as being a short-lived life. But now let's add the third person, Haran. It's true, we don't know how old Haran was when he died, but we do know he died in Babel. And we were able to figure out the parameters of how old he could have been, 48 to 89 years old. We then showed how old his brother lived, 175 years, and revealed he lived at most half of his brother's lifetime. So if we show the 3 deaths, Peleg, Nahor the first, and Haran, and highlight them in red on the list, make a special note that all 3 people died before their life expectancies, then we can see this list of Shem's descendants starting to reveal something. Can you see what it reveals? Okay, we'll show one last thing to make it clear. Get rid of everything except for the list, then we'll add the thumbnail to our video about Nimrod. We've been talking about this video throughout. I am no expert in Hebrew, but I think the section in Genesis 10 about Nimrod has been mistranslated since the beginning. I went over the Hebrew in that video, but you're going to have to watch it to see how it was broken down. But here is this verse about Nimrod properly translated. You can see from the very first words how it was supposed to be understood. Nimrod isn't even a person at all, but the rebellion against God. The identity of Nimrod is actually Cush. He is the leader behind the Tower of Babel. But I want to focus on the quote in verse 9. Like the rebellion, the mighty hunt to the face of the Lord. We've talked about how Babylon was the origin of astrology and astrology, the worship of stars. Look back at the list and how Noah, Shem, and Eber in blue were singled out as faithful followers of God. And that name Eber became the name of those true to Yahweh, the Hebrew people. Then the verse in Joshua talked about how the Israelite ancestors had worshipped other gods in Babel and called out Terah in yellow, specifically as having abandoned Yahweh to worship other gods. Then we take special note of the 3 deaths in red. 3 people that died prematurely, none of which lived out their life expectancy. Haran died in Babel, and Peleg and Nahor in the same year. Then we go back to the quote about the open rebellion against God, the mighty hunt to the face of the Lord. This sounds like the people were being hunted and forced to worship stars. And if they didn't, they were being killed, like Peleg, Nahor, and Haran. We don't know about the other 4 names in white before Terah, but that really doesn't matter. The worship of stars was being forced on this chosen descendant line of Shem, the last people loyal to Yahweh. We'll end this part by going back to the timeline. We have put forward that the dispersal of Babel probably occurred at the same time frame of Noah's end-of-life blessing. We know that Haran died before the dispersal of Babel, while he and his father Terah were still in Babel. Then Peleg and Nahor I both died in the same year, 1996, and all 3 deaths had their lives cut short from the life expectancies from their generation. I think both the deaths of Peleg and Nahor occurring in the same year is significant and reveals that the dispersal of Babel happened in the year 1996, in years after creation. The deaths of God's people trying to be loyal to Yahweh was what caused this to happen. But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the sons of men had built. And the Lord said, Indeed the people are one, and they all have one language, and this is what they begin to do. Now nothing that they propose to do will be withheld from them. Come, let us go down, and there confuse their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. The Lord came down to stop the city and the tower from being built. There was a threat to his chosen descendant line that would get us to Jesus Christ. They were being forced to worship other gods, or else they were being killed. This is why God came down to stop the city and the tower, confuse the people's languages, and separate the people into their own nations.
The deeper you go, the more dark and sinister the story of the Tower of Babel gets. I think we finally nailed the true depth in the story of the tower. But if you think I've used eisegesis and wrongly interpreted the Tower of Babel, then I have one less angle to present to you. It's something that is key to my channel and my central focus, and that focus is on the parallels. If these parallels fit together perfectly as I put forward, then not only will they show you what will happen in the future, but they will also show you what happened in the past. They go both ways. I've been speaking about the 3 stages of Babylon in the Bible. The first stage is Nimrod and this Tower of Babel. The second stage is in the book of Kings, Jeremiah, and Daniel about Babylon coming to Jerusalem, taking the people into exile, and destroying the temple and city. And the last stage is in the book of Revelation and the great city of Babylon in end times.
We'll put the 3 stages of Babylon into a chart for you. The first column will be stage 1, and what this channel has come up with as an interpretation of chapters 9, 10, and 11 in Genesis. The leader of the Tower of Babel is Cush, the son of Ham. One of the things that is said in Genesis 10 about Cush is that he was a mighty hunter, and we've taken that to mean that he provided food for the people. We know from the tower story that all the earth was one. Everyone alive was in Babel, so that Cush was the leader of the world. The name Eber evolved to be the name of the Hebrew people, and that meant that people were marked as God's people with this name. We've taken the position that the Tower of Babel was about forced worship of stars. We've gotten there with the information that Babylon was the origin of worshiping stars, added to the tower's top being in the heavens, the same symbolic height as the stars. In addition, we read the dream of Jacob's ladder, being God's prophetic answer to the tower, and how his loyal angels ascend on his ladder, while Satan, the disloyal angel, was behind the Tower of Babel. Then we've shown how Noah said that Yahweh was the God of Shem only. Eber became the name of the Hebrew people and added that 3 people from the line of Shem died before their life expectancies and extrapolated that to mean that force was being applied to worshiping the stars and death was the penalty for not worshiping. And these deaths were the reason why God came down to stop the building of the tower and disperse the people from Babel into separate nations. In the second stage of Babylon, while the Jewish people go into exile in Babylon, there is one person who is mentioned in 9 books of the Bible that had power over God's people, and he is Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. If you want to know about Nebuchadnezzar, then one book to read up on is the book of Daniel. And right away in chapter 1, there's an interesting story about King Nebuchadnezzar taking the gifted people from Israel to serve in the king's palace. And note this, and the king appointed for them a daily provision of the king's delicacies. Now this story goes on to say that Daniel refuses to defile himself with the king's food and survives on vegetables. By the way, this is where the Daniel diet comes from. But if you go back to our parallels, we could say that Nebuchadnezzar provided food, which matches the interpretation that Cush, being a mighty hunter, meaning great in stature, was also providing food for the people. You see how this fits? But let's go to the third stage of Babylon in the Bible, and that is in the book of Revelation when we get to the Antichrist. And if you want to read about the Antichrist, most people interpret the second beast in chapter 13 as the Antichrist. And we read this, "And that no one may buy or sell except one who has the mark or the name of the beast." And as we go back to the parallels, just think about the ramifications of not being able to buy or sell. The Antichrist will control food. So you can see all 3 stages of Babylon have references to the leader of the world providing or controlling food. We will do a video soon about prepping for end times and what we can do. But these parallels fit and reinforce that Cush was providing food for the people, and that was why he was a mighty hunter. Now we're going to talk about the second parallel and how in the Tower of Babel story all the earth was one and spoke the same language. That means that Cush was the leader of the world over all the people of the earth. Now for the second stage with Nebuchadnezzar, in the book of Jeremiah, we first see how God describes giving the king of Babylon all the lands, so all the nations shall serve him. Then we add Daniel 3, a key chapter in the story of Nebuchadnezzar that talks about forcing people to worship a golden statue. But look at the first part of the decree. To you it is commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages. The command went out to all peoples, nations, and languages. Nebuchadnezzar reigned over all. We come back to the parallels and see that Nebuchadnezzar commanded all the nations, just like Cush. Now let's go to the book of Revelation and see how it describes the first beast in chapter 13. And authority was given him over every tribe, tongue, and nation. You think this language about every tribe, tongue, and nation is an accident? I don't. We'll put this back into the parallels and see how Cush, Nebuchadnezzar, and the beast all had or will have authority over every nation, tribe, and tongue. And the parallels connect again. Now we'll go on to the next one, and how we've interpreted the name Eber becoming the name of the Hebrews, the faithful followers of Yahweh. Now before the second stage of Babylon, in the second book of Kings, we see the first use of the word Jews. This term becomes important because after Israel demands a king to rule over them, Israel drifts away from God, and the kingdom divides into 2, north and south. The southern kingdom was called Judah, and the people who followed the religion of that kingdom were called Jews. And that brings us back to the same chapter 3 in Daniel. After the king's decree, there were people who refused to worship a statue. Those people were called Jews. God's people who would not worship the statue had a name. And so if we bring it back to the chart, we see God's faithful people had a new name, Jews, just like the first stage where God's people were named. Now, what about the third stage and the Antichrist? First, we go to the section about the faithful church of Philadelphia in chapter 3. We see how it describes the person who overcomes will have the name of God written on him. They will be marked as God's people. But how does that fit into the story of the beast? Again, we go to chapter 13 and see how the beast had authority to make war with the saints. That Greek word hagion just means people separated for God. People marked for God. So we come back to the parallels and see how the last stage also has people marked as God's people. And when we look back at all three stages of Babylon, they all have faithful followers of God, being marked with a name as God's people. The next thing is about Cush forcing people to worship the stars, or else they were put to death. Now you might think I'm forcing these things together, because the text doesn't specifically say what I'm saying here. But wait until you see these parallels. We go back to the key chapter in Daniel 3 for this parallel. To you it is commanded, you shall fall down and worship the gold image, and whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast immediately into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. Forced worship, and unless the people worshiped the statue, there was the penalty of death. So we go back to our chart and see that the second stage had forced worship with the penalty of death, just like the interpretation of the Tower of Babel. Can you see what I'm talking about here and how I got here? But what about the third stage and the Antichrist? For those of you who read the Bible will know where this is headed. Back to Revelation 13, the key chapter about the Antichrist. And he deceives those who dwell on the earth by those signs which he was granted to do in the sight of the beast, telling those who dwell on the earth to make an image to the beast, who was wounded by the sword and lived. He was granted power to give breath to the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak and cause as many as would not worship the image of the beast to be killed. First, an image is made of the beast, and then if people don't worship the image, they are to be killed. Once again, forced worship. And the penalty is death. You see how all these parallels fit perfectly? And in the first stage at the Tower of Babel, how I took the premature deaths of 3 people from the chosen descendant line of Shem and took that to mean they were being killed. These all line up perfectly because God had them connect perfectly. He's communicating to us through these parallels. Now, this last one is based on how we got here. Since there were people marked for God, faced with forced worship under the penalty of death, then when God came down to see the city and the tower that man had built, this takes on a whole new meaning. This means he was saving his faithful people, the Hebrews, and his plan of salvation through them. That is why Eber became the name that was singled out by the author of Genesis 10. God saved the people marked for God. But what about the second stage? You know what we're going to find. King Nebuchadnezzar ordered everyone to worship a golden statue, under the penalty of death if they didn't. Daniel's 3 friends refused to worship the golden statue. Then the king is outraged and has them thrown into the fiery furnace. Let's read Daniel 3 from here. Did we not cast 3 men bound into the midst of the fire? Look, he answered, I see 4 men loose, walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt, and the form of the 4th is like the Son of God. Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came from the midst of the fire. Yes, active Bible readers know this story, how the 3 faithful followers of God survived the fire. But let's highlight the important point here. The form of the 4th man in the fire is like the Son of God. Jesus Christ was in the fire with the 3 men and saved them from the fire. So when we come back to the parallels, we see how God again had saved his faithful people, named and marked for God, just like the first stage of Babylon at the Tower of Babel. And if Revelation 13 is about the 2 beasts, including the Antichrist, then we should find God's response in the next chapter 14. A lamb standing on Mount Zion, and with him 144,000, having his father's name written on their foreheads. Right after the people are forced to have the mark, God responds with the 144,000 having his father's name written on their forehead. Now, don't take this number literally. There will be many more people saved. This number represents the outer area of the last refuge city, heaven. We'll do a video about this in the next year. But the important point is that right after chapter 13, and forced worship of the image with people marked for the beast, God responds by marking his people. Then a little bit further down in chapter 14, it completes the parallel. If anyone worships the beast and his image, and receives his mark on his forehead or on his hand, he himself shall also drink of the wine of the wrath of God. The Bible is clear. If you take the mark and worship the beast, you're not going to make it. Then we'll connect this all together. Here is the patience of the saints. Here are those who keep the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus. And blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on. Then guess who happens to save the day? Then I looked, and behold, a white cloud, and on the cloud sat one like the Son of Man. Nearly all Bible readers will know that the reference to the Son of Man is a reference to Jesus Christ, one of the titles he called himself. So when we come back to the parallels, we see after the people were marked for the beast and God marked others for himself, then Jesus Christ came down to save his marked people. And this completes the last parallel on the bottom and how God came down each time to save the people marked for God. In fact, I believe in these parallels so much, I'll go even further than this, since they connect perfectly. In stage 2, the king saw someone like the Son of God, who as Christians we know as Jesus Christ. In stage 3, Jesus Christ again comes down to save the people marked for God. That means in Genesis 11:5, when the Lord came down to see the city and the tower, it was the pre-incarnate Jesus Christ himself who came down to see the city and save his people from being marked for death by the evil Cush. Just look at all these parallels and how they all connect perfectly. These parallels reinforce this video's interpretation of Genesis 10.
The Tower of Babel was a dark time for God's people. There was an open rebellion against God by Cush and Ham. They were forcing people to worship the stars. There were loyal people to God, including Noah, Shem, and Eber. And Eber became the name and eventually the language for the Hebrew people. They were marked for God as his people. But Cush didn't accept that. He started killing the Hebrew people, God's people, like Haran, Nahor the First, and Peleg. That is when the pre-incarnate Jesus Christ came down to confuse the languages, saving his people to disperse all the people and scatter them in the nations according to their families. And this dispersal point of Babel was noted 10 times in the Table of Nations. There was a threat to God's plan, and he saved his people to get to the birth of Jesus Christ and the redemption of mankind. When you study a big subject like the Table of Nations, you have to go deeper. Take the knowledge you've already gained. Look at the original Hebrew text. In addition, you should use as many tools as you can, even new ones like analyzing the biblical timeline and average lifespans to see if you can gain more knowledge that way. And when you come at it many different ways, you can connect it with the parallels to get a much deeper picture of the Tower of Babel, the open rebellion against God and his people. The next videos on this channel will be about the mark of the beast and other sections of the Bible. There are many. I hope you enjoyed this video, and may God bless you all.